This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 7 of the long out-of-print, long memory-hold book, Lords of the Press, by George Seldes, from 1938. Chapter 7, The Light That Failed. Employees of the Scripps Howard newspapers throughout the United States were the first to realize that the Howard policy had won, that changes were being made, that the swing to reaction was definite. The public did not know much about it. There were, and still are, liberal and progressive editorials, alternating with reactionary and obscurantist editorials, and frequently the spirit of lusty scripts pervades the news columns too. When Howard engaged Benjamin Stolberg to write a series of articles purporting to expose the CIO by charging communist intrigue or control of the new great liberal labor movement, the organization's spokesman replied by calling Stolberg a quote-unquote poison pen man. The communist organs labeled him, quote, America's #1 literary stool pigeon, unquote, and Robert Forsyth coined the phrase, quote-unquote, parlor fink. Mr. Stolberg was deeply hurt and very angry, especially over the general accusation that he was a, quote-unquote, renegade socialist. He contends he wrote the articles to help certain CIO leaders, his friends, purge the movement of the communists in time. But that is not our concern here. Our concern is the motive of Mr. Howard. Howard advertised Stolberg as a radical who would tell the quote-unquote inside story of the CIO. The connotation being that he would attack, and attack he did. Now, of course, under the American tradition, every man has the right to speak and publish, although that right cannot be well exercised when it opposes a corrupt political machine, such as those in Jersey City or Newark, or fascist groups, such as the American Legion of Terre Haute and Tampa, and in thousands of other cases. Nevertheless, Mr. Stolberg has the right to criticize, and Mr. Howard the right to attack. And their critics certainly have the right to question the ethics of both. Mr. Stolberg's only possible excuse for doing these articles for Howard would be that he was unaware that Howard today is in the same class as Mr. Hearst. I cannot imagine any ethical writer doing such a series for a Hearst newspaper. It may be good business to have a literary agent sell one's output without consideration of the character of the journal which will publish it, but it is another to sell oneself to Mr. Hearst for the purpose of defaming a labor movement. There is an ethic of place as well as an ethic of words. If Mr. Stolberg did not realize he was being made the usual Howardian cat's paw, and that the difference between Howard and Hearst today is frequently only in size of type, it would be nice to hear him make a public explanation. The Stolberg series marked the emergence of Howard as one of the leaders in the anti-labor movement in America. The fitting accolade was given by Tom Girdler, who was delighted to find, quote, a radical like Benjamin Stolberg, pointing to the insidious communistic influences in the CIO, unquote, as revealed in the Scripps Howard Press. The Girdlers and Weirs and Liberty Leaguers everywhere approved Stolberg and Howard, but there were, as expected, numerous protests and demands for retractions and correction from the unions. How did Mr. Howard reply to the latter? Did he grant them the inviolable right of redress, which is inherent in the freedom of the press? Did he even make a pretense of publishing the rebuttal? The answer is yes, he made a pretense. In every city where one of the 24 Scripps Howard papers is published, there was a chance to test the code of ethics of the press. In New York City, for example, Michael J. Quill, international president of the Transport Workers Union of America, informed Lee B. Wood, executive editor of the World Telegram, that Stolberg twisted facts and published, quote, vicious and obvious distortions and untruths, unquote. Quill continued, quote, we recognize that you publish this letter. We deem it our duty to allow an official spokesman designated by the CIO to use an equal amount of space in your paper, at a time when the progressive labor movement is waging a serious fight for organizational unity, economic security, industrial democracy, and political liberty. Its enemies are expected to produce their Girdlers, Haigs, Berghoffs, and Stolbergs. Your paper has chosen to share the disgrace of the Hearst press, serving as a channel for their hatred of labor and progress. If the World Telegram does not make amends for the series of articles by Mr. Stolberg, it will remain condemned in the eyes and in the minds of its readers as being guilty of suppressing the truth and of disseminating calumnies, lies, and misstatements about the American labor movement and its most progressive leaders and institutions, unquote. Mr. Wood, or Mr. Howard, or both, refused to give the CIO the space requested. And worse than that, they printed only a part of Quill's letter, suppressing the demand for space and the paragraphs cited above. In San Francisco, Mr. Howard's news has always enjoyed the support of labor, and with enthusiasm after the 1934 strike. When its managing editor, Frank A. Clairvaux, received the Stolberg series, he cautiously prefixed the announcement that, quote, the San Francisco News and other Scripps Howard newspapers are publishing the Stolberg story of the CIO as a matter of historical interest, unquote. But even that was not enough. The Stolberg articles dealing with the Pacific Coast differed from the originals. In the World Telegram, for instance, Mr. Stolberg came to this conclusion about the situation on the coast, quote, the resulting bitterness is incredible. It broke up the powerful Maritime Federation of the Pacific, which today is on its last legs, unquote. Perhaps the Union there is centipedal. At any rate, in the news, the Stolberg verdict of history is different. It reads, quote, the resulting bitterness is incredible. It threatens to break up the powerful Maritime Federation of the Pacific, unquote. Parentheses. There is no mention of last legs, not even penultimate ones, end parentheses. There are an additional score of instances in which supposed facts and stated opinions are changed or deleted in California. When Stolberg accuses Bridges of being, quote, devious, unquote, of, quote, playing both ends against the middle, unquote, of fighting the CIO, and California unions of being, quote, up in arms against Bridges, unquote, and John L. Lewis, quote, showing signs of regretting, unquote, the appointment of Bridges. All these references are missing in California. Obviously, one of the two Howard papers is not publishing the facts uncolored. In Toledo, Ohio, John Brophy, national director of the CIO, told a huge meeting that, quote, an erstwhile liberal chain of newspapers which has capitalized over the years on a reputation of being liberal and progressive, hires a renegade radical to do the dirty work of besmirching the labor movement, unquote. The labor movement must, quote, serve notice to the newspapers which discredit labor, unquote. This speech was delivered on January 21st, 1938. It certainly was news in Toledo, but Howard's News B, which carefully reported the meeting, suppressed all criticism of Stolberg and the Howard chain. Whether an Ohio speech is still news in New York is open to question. If the World Telegram had never printed a line about it, no professional newspaper man would have found fault. But what happened in New York was this. The World Telegram did not print the news on the 22nd, the 23rd, or the 24th. But on the night of the 25th, after numerous CIO and other publications had accused it of suppressing the news, the World Telegram carried a few paragraphs. Here is one of them. Here is Brophy's speech. Quote, these papers claim to be liberal, but when the test comes, they capitulate to the doctrines of Hearst. They become anti-labor and anti-liberal. Well, we are finding out who are our enemies, unquote. Here is the World Telegram's version of it. Quote, he did not mention the Scripps Howard newspapers by name, but described the group as an erstwhile liberal chain, which has now accepted the doctrines of Hearst, and said, we are now finding out who are our friends, unquote. Friends or enemies? In Akron, the Industrial Union Council went on record, quote, condemning the recent series of articles by Benjamin Stolberg in the Akron Times-Press and other Scripps Howard newspapers as prejudiced, distorted, and inaccurate, unquote, and charged that their publication was prompted by Mr. Roy Howard's intense hatred of the CIO in general and the American Newspaper Guild in particular. Elsewhere, similar actions were taken. In the CIO press, the comparison between Hearst and Howard was made frequently, with the intimation that the labor boycott, which had caused Mr. Hearst a considerable financial as well as moral headache, might sometime be invoked against Hearst's would-be successor. But Mr. Howard has not been frightened. In fact, it would not surprise anyone in the newspaper game to learn that the chain's advertising solicitors are using this threat from the CIO as a means of selling more space to big business. Red baiting is also a means to good business. In the case of Simon W. Gerson, a reporter on the Communist Daily Worker, appointed to a city job by Borough President Stanley M. Isaacs because of his fitness and despite his political associations, the World Telegram indulged in the usual Hearst style of journalism. In the office of the paper, the order was given to, quote-unquote, get Gerson. There was no longer a pretense at publishing straight news. There was a crusade on, and news was manufactured in just the way Hearst, waging a campaign against imaginary Reds in the schools and colleges of America for several years, got his reporters to try every known trick to fabricate a story where none existed. But apparently the Howard boys have not yet learned all the Hearst tricks. Their journalistic hearts may not be in their work, and their journalistic tongues are surely in their cheeks. about the most sensational item which Mr. Wood was able to show Mr. Howard was one saying that, quote, 2 months before his appointment, Gerson wrote an article in which he urged the Communist Party to continue an active recruiting drive after election. It was discovered today, unquote. One of Mr. Wood's great discoveries. And this is followed by another sensational discovery, namely that Gerson is, quote, under fire by the American Legion and numerous other patriotic, civic, and religious groups, unquote. For some 20 years, the Scripps Howard newspapers were among the few which, from time to time, showed up the excesses of the Legion, its provocation of violence, its denial of civil rights to minorities. But today, it cheers the same organization which is notoriously the stooge of big business, and according to General Smedley Butler, the biggest strike-breaking agency in America. Yeah, I'm going to trust Smedley Butler on that one. He's a good guy. That was a sound, decent man. You got to read his War is a Racket. Wow. They ought to be teaching that in history classes. The quote-unquote religious groups are not mentioned because the Howard sheet knows it will do its baiting campaign no good to say that certain reactionary Catholic organizations and publications are in this business. Nor are the professional patriots named, because in almost all cases, such patriotic organizations are found to be the subsidiaries of labor-hating big business organizations. Everyone who knows anything at all about politics knows that red baiting is not just red baiting. It is the first and sometimes the last, but always the most important weapon of reaction. It is, in fact, so important that Mussolini invented a quote-unquote communist menace in 1925 as a reason for his attack on labor and the cooperatives in 1919. Other dictators use red baiting with or without reason. Hitler had at least some 7 million communist voters to blame for his party's anti-communist policy. But since we are no friend of Japan's, we can see in her Red Scare, as an excuse for her attack on China, the utter falsity and hypocrisy of raising the red banner in attacking one's enemies for egotistic, financial, or political purposes. So with Mr. Howard. The policy of, quote, pinning the red label, unquote, on one's adversaries, which was also adopted by American business, and notably by the National Electric Light Association's fight against public ownership, is now a Howard policy in fighting the progressive labor movement. He has not yet reached the dictatorial heights of attacking all labor and all liberalism as red and subversive, but he is undoubtedly well on the road. An indication can be seen in the distorted reporting of all recent campaigns in which labor, the labor parties, and especially the progressive CIO has participated, and the general attack on pro-labor legislation. Thus, in recent months, the Scripps Howard papers in many cities have burst into violent attacks on secondary picketing, that is, picketing of advertisers, which is a matter much closer to the newspaper pocketbook than picketing in general. And all the pro-labor legislation, which has marked the halting march of the New Deal. In all the recent election tests, the Scripps Howard headlines and the Hearst headlines could well have been substituted, because they tell the same story of, quote, CIO plowed under, unquote, quote, Lewis rebuffed in bid for power, unquote, quote, labor turns in Pennsylvania, unquote, and, quote, New Deal repudiated, unquote. Should the New Deal, labor, or the CIO make any progress somewhere, that fact is not suppressed, but so minimized that the lay reader will not be impressed by it. He is either muddled or misled or left ignorant of the facts when the facts are available to every reporter. Sounds like your average American citizen today. You know, facts aren't totally suppressed, but they are minimized. You know, the real truth. The average Joe is muddled and misled and left ignorant of the facts. But the facts are out there. The facts are available. You just have to learn how to glean. Get off the major media. Turn your TV off. Turn your radio off. Stop subscribing to major magazines and going to Barnes & Noble for your history books. Don't trust your Houghton Mifflin textbooks, etc. Continuing with the book. The World Telegram headline, quote, CIO candidate trails Martin in Oregon vote, unquote, May 21st, was soon enough corrected when Hess defeated Martin. But in Pennsylvania, on May 19th, the paper saw Earl's victory as the, quote, political plucking of John L. Lewis's eyebrows, unquote. The quote-unquote political menace of the CIO, the editorial continued, is over, and so is Mr. Lewis's hope that, quote, he could scowl his way to political power, unquote. The election, the paper suspects, quote, is a turning point in America's labor movement, a turning away from the false path of politics and back toward unionism's true objectives, unquote. The facts are that a swing of 33,000 votes would have elected CIO's Kennedy. The fact is that Kennedy carried the entire state of Pennsylvania except the two reactionary cities, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where the old, quote-unquote, corrupted and contented Republican and Democratic Party machines have seldom been routed. Kennedy carried the rural population, but did not do well in his own mining towns, where he felt the antagonism of the AF of L. But generally speaking, the labor movement in politics, despite all its defeats, is getting along remarkably well, and 10 times faster than the British Labour Party went in its long fight for power. The Scripps Howard Press can speak of nothing but labor defeats, but an inquiring reporter at the United States Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers will hear quite a different story about the march of labor into national politics. Big business is scared, but it is willing to face the situation rather than distort the news about it. The test of a free press is its resistance to pressures. Money, usually in the form of advertising, is still, in my opinion, the medium of greatest pressure. But on the other side, reader pressure is becoming more and more apparent. There are racial, religious, and patriotic groups, as well as political groups, which either directly influence the press or, by the very fact of their existence, scare our editors into euphemism, hypocrisy, or silence. Pressure need not necessarily be sinister. Surely the labor unions, which began a peaceful boycott of Hearst in 1934, were acting in their own defense and merit the applause of all people who believe in the economic weapon rather than the violence, which is usually the employer's weapon. Today, the labor pressure on newspapers is growing and will become powerful when labor grows more aware of the fact that the press has, in most cases, been its greatest enemy while pretending to be its greatest friend. But the biggest pressure group in the nation today is Catholic. When Haywood Broun was fired from the old World 10 years ago, it was for writing a piece beginning, quote, "There ought to be a place in New York City for a liberal newspaper," unquote, and ending with a description of selfish pressure groups which make cowards of editors and destroy the courage and tenacity of the press. Concludes Broun, quote, "Admitting the danger of generalities, I would contend that the Irish are the crybabies of the Western world. Even the mildest quip will set them off into resolutions and protests, and still more precarious is the position of the New York newspaper man who ventures any criticism of the Catholic Church. There is not a single New York editor who does not live in mortal terror of the power of this group. If the Church can bluff its way into a preferred position, the fault lies not with the Catholics, but with the editors," unquote. 10 years ago, the Catholic Church was on the defensive. Today, it is on the aggressive. And there is 10 times the fear of it that there was a decade ago. Father Curran of the International Catholic Truth Society, parentheses, God save the mark, end parentheses, changed the policy of one newspaper because he controlled $20,000 of business, parentheses, New Republic, December 30th, 1936, end parentheses, and had the effrontery to boast of this outrageous attack on the freedom of the press. But it is general Catholic pressure, not $20,000, which frightens, if it does not wholly corrupt, many other newspapers. It was no surprise, then, to see Roy Howard's newspapers suppress Pegler's column, spring 1938, in which this pugnacious writer, himself educated in a Jesuit school, very rightly attacked Franco. The Catholic Church in America, with few exceptions, has supported that child murderer, and 2 cardinals have defended Franco. Hayes prayed for him. At a time, the Pope openly demanded that Franco stop the murder of civilians. Quote, "If I were a Spaniard who had seen Franco's missionary work among the children, I might see him in hell, but never in church," unquote, concluded Pegler in the column the Scripps Howard papers did not have the courage to publish. Fellow newspapermen sympathize with Howard in the Pegler case because every reporter knows how deep and vicious is the hatred which press criticism of any religious sect always causes. The World Telegram is no braver than the Old World, which lived and died a liberal newspaper in withstanding Catholic pressure, or other pressures for that matter, and no one expects any American publisher to do otherwise. But it is a quite different matter when the Howard papers begin suppressing their columnists because of liberal views which differ from that of our silk-hatted and white-spatted Napoleon. Most of the daily columnists are conservative and reactionary, a necessary requirement for getting into the big money. Most of them speak as oracles of reason, common sense, good sense, and, of course, straight American liberalism. Only once in a while do they write that way, too. In many newspapers which buy several of the notable columns, there is usually an editorial foreword absolving the publisher of sharing in the views of the writer. In Mr. Howard's papers there is no such foreword, but there is, on the other hand, considerable suppression. Thus, when General Hugh S. Johnson, for once forsaking obscurantist fields, writes of John L. Lewis, that same Lewis of the CIO, of which the Howard-hated newspaper guild is a part, that he is, quote, one of the best, unquote, and that the American people, quote, would be better off if more of our leaders in both political and business fields were more like John Lewis, unquote, Mr. Howard promptly suppresses General Johnson. The public, of course, did not know of this, but a still greater mystery is General Johnson's statement about a week after this suppression, in which he claimed he is uncensored. On April 28, 1938, he boasted that, although he had split with Roosevelt, he had not joined forces with the Roosevelt haters, and added, quote, I don't have to. In the freedom of the American press, which still prevails, and the liberalism of the Scripps Howard newspapers, of which I am an exponent, I am permitted to say whatever I please. I may be backed up against the front door, but I have at least the assurance that what is said here is influenced by nobody. I wouldn't trade my job for anybody's. It couldn't happen in any other country. That is why I think the relatively new institution of columns is worthwhile. I read all my contemporaries, unquote. What garbage. But apparently not his own, at least not the suppressed columns. Haywood Broun, one of the few syndicated non-reactionaries, is not only suppressed from time to time for expressing ideas which Howard doesn't approve, but his daily copy is actually censored by Lee Wood. So crude is the Wood pencil that World Telegram employees have numerous samples of paragraphs which don't make sense because Wood has not censored well, and also another quote-unquote before and after series in which Wood, or Howard, has mowed Broun down between the first and second editions. Raymond Clapper, Washington columnist, and Dorothy Dunbar Bromley, parenthesis, who has just left Scripps Howard for the more congenial atmosphere of the Post, end parentheses, have also been suppressed for expressing the mildest of liberal ideas, and even the artists have felt the reactionary whip. In fact, the troubles which Kirby and Wortman have had may illustrate, perhaps better than the news columns, the fact that Roy Howard has developed an anti-social conscience. When a Wortman picture is suppressed because a strikebreaker says, quote, even a good scab can't find work now, unquote, such action must put the suppressor in the class of scab employers. And according to The Nation, Rollin Kirby, a very forceful cartoonist who thoroughly believes in middle-of-the-road liberalism, has been forced to share in Howard's anti-Gerson red-baiting campaign by drawing a picture, quote, for which he later apologized in a letter to a friend, unquote. The public never knows about news censorship, but when columns are omitted, even laymen begin to ask questions, and the letters are beginning to worry Howard. He has been forced to make personal replies. Here is one of his typical explanations. Quote, if by the terms curtailed or blocked out You mean to inquire whether columnists writing for the World Telegram are having their matter submitted to a censorship calculated to controversial statements or statements in opposition to the editorial policy of the paper? We'll say that the answer is no. The World Telegram has available for its use each day the signed product of some 25 columnists whose stuff is contracted for by the paper. Space limitations make impossible use of any given day of much more than half of this stuff. In the selection of that matter used, the same test of quality, importance, interest, and readability is applied as in the case of all other editorial matter. As publishers of an independent paper, which is our objective, the World Telegram welcomes the presentation of conflicting ideas and viewpoints, the presentation of which we regard as the most desirable function of a truly independent press, which must be the foundation of an intelligently functioning democratic system." Unquote. What a liar. These are the press lords, huh? These liars. Continuing. "It is no use going to the length of refuting this statement. When Mayor Haig raved for an hour at a recent mass meeting, it was a World Telegram representative, Ed Johnson, who involuntarily spoke the one word which destroyed the entire Haig oration. Mr. Johnson said, quote unquote, 'nuts.' And to Mr. Howard, the newspapermen who have seen this letter simply say, quote unquote, 'nonsense.'" Life does not give most men any choice whatever, but to few, and notably to leaders of public opinion, it frequently offers the alternative of loot or laurels. For editors and publishers, the choice is hard because the newspaper business has become a big business, and the basis of big business is loot and not laurels. The greatest documentary exposure of the financial corruption of the majority of the newspapers of America is the 72-volume report of the Federal Trade Commission, which accuses the National Electric Light Association, the Propaganda and Bribery Department of the Public Utilities, of poisoning the mind of the entire people through its $25 million a year newspaper advertising fund. The NELA, at its annual conventions, boasted that it had, quote unquote, reached 4/5 of the press, but this figure may be slightly exaggerated. They did, quote unquote, reach a majority. The corruption fund, it was disclosed at one of these conventions, was actually taken from the victims' pockets. The managing editor of the National Electric Light Association urged his associates to spend lavishly because the public, perennial suckers, always footed the bill. His actual words were, quote, "All the money being spent is worthwhile. Don't be afraid of the expense. The public pays the expense," unquote. The head of this organization, which the Federal Trade Commission so thoroughly exposed, was Merlin H. Aylesworth. When the NELA was disbanded, Aylesworth went into straight selling of advertising, and he has been so successful in advertising that, a few months ago, Roy Howard appointed him publisher of the World Telegram. If Roy Howard had searched the whole world over for a gesture to show the world of big business that it had won, and the last trace of Scripsian idealism was gone, he could not have done better than to choose the former director of the biggest propaganda fund that ever fought the free press of America. Under the Aylesworth regime, for example, a story which makes the front page of the Post becomes merely financial news on page 23 of the World Telegram. Here are some examples. From the Post, page 1, State bars brokers in 16 million fraud. In the World Telegram, page 23, Bennett files suit to restrain 41 names in trust conspiracy. From the Post, page 1, Payne Weber enjoined from stock trading. From the World Telegram, page 23, Payne Weber among defendants in proceedings. Under the Aylesworth regime, the World Telegram makes a weekly hero of Bruce Barton, who, in addition to being a congressman, is the chairman of the board of Batten, Barton, Durston, and Osborne, distributors of enormous advertising money. I have not kept a file, but recently noticed the following items. May 2nd, quote, Barton backs plan to reduce taxes for job creators, unquote. May 11th, quote, Nation must take middle road now, Barton believes, unquote. June 1st, quote, Barton demands wide reforms of auto insurance, unquote. June 6th, quote, Barton urges recess study of 7 deadly sores, unquote. Mr. Barton is also public relations advisor of the Republican National Committee, and according to the Guild Reporter, he has sent Republican propaganda to editors with his advertising card attached, quote, and doubtless the publishers got the idea, unquote. I cannot give details here of the Scripps-Howard wars against Governor Davie of Ohio and certain whiskey distillers, nor do I care to speak in favor of Davie, but the governor produced the letters from the Cleveland press to Shenley distillers to back up his statement that, quote, it is fully evident that the motive back of the Scripps crusade was not a moral regard for the political welfare, but it was a strictly cash register crusade, unquote. It is hard to imagine Scripps ever being mixed up in such events and charges, with all their crusades in behalf of labor and the underdog and clean politics, and a better America being challenged as inspired by the money till, and not the Scripps quote-unquote soul. But it is the expected behavior of an Aylesworth-Howard regime. I have no space for many more examples which show how this great newspaper chain, which E.W. Scripps founded in his quest for the laurel, has become, under Howard's rule, a means of dragging in the advertising loot. But one more interesting fact must be stated. Many years ago, when Collier's was fighting the bad medicine men, it branded the Proprietary Association of America, which controlled $40 million worth of newspaper advertising, quote, an organization of quack doctors and patent medicine makers, unquote. Now the National Advertising Department of the Scripps-Howard newspapers has become an associate member of the Proprietary Association for the purpose of cooperating with the Advisory Committee on Advertising. Mr. Scripps said, there could not be a free press if it depended on advertising. Mr. Howard joins the medicine ad man. Mr. Scripps founded a newspaper to serve the working man. Mr. Howard attacks labor. The younger Scripps restated the policy of liberalism. Mr. Howard suppresses the liberal columnists. The elder Scripps shunned the rich, but through a consistent and honest policy, built up a $30 million business. His present successor has achieved a pinnacle of fame by being listed with the Mellons, DuPonts, and other multi-millionaire legal tax dodgers. There is almost nothing left of the Scripps empire. Buildings, business, machines, material things worth millions, but only a few cents worth of spirit, and that flickering in few of his 24 cities. And the symbol, the lighthouse, it still stands on the editorial page of all the Howard newspapers, casting two-dimensional beams, right and left. But that light years ago showed Howard that the loot was to be found at only one end of the beam, the right, and he has never returned to either left or center. The light itself, the Scripps light, is dead, another light that failed. And this concludes Chapter 7 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We'll take a break and be back in a few.
We're back. Time for Chapter 8 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Chapter 8, A Jewish Press Lord. There is only one metropolitan newspaper which was founded neither for money, nor for the hope of making money, nor the personal advancement of its owner. It has a circulation of more than 250,000 copies daily, is worth at least $1 million, has given away about $1 million, paid its scrub women $37 a week, encouraged genius and the arts, and once didn't give a damn for advertising. This paper, one of the few non-commercial journals in the world, is the Jewish Daily Forward. Abe Cahan, its elected editor and publisher, can be discharged by a vote of his colleagues, but, in every sense of the word, Abe Cahan ranks as one of the press lords of America. He was born in Vilna, Russia, the son of a Hebrew teacher, in 1860, and arrived in the United States in 1882. He had no intention of becoming a Jewish editor, his first ambition being to shine in the English language field, and the second and greater ambition to devote himself to novel writing. He wrote The Rise of David Levinsky, which, in addition to being an important contribution to Americana, is a good novel, and also Jekyll. These works of fiction show that he was on the road to becoming a major American novelist when the insistent pressure of all his friends, who knew he was a journalist of the first rank, forced him into the editorship of the cooperative Jewish Daily Forward. He had tried the Sun first, then the Evening Post, then the Commercial Advertiser, where Lincoln Steffens gave him the job. On these three papers he learned the American style of journalism, and it is precisely because the Forward, under his direction, was American in spirit, despite its foreign language, that it became so great a success. The Forward was founded in 1897. In the previous year, Daniel De Leon, in Chicago, split the socialist and labor movement by moving far to the left, whereupon Meyer London, Dr. Isaac Auerwitsch, and Abe Cahan, and a few others, organized the Social Democratic Party and began publishing the Forward as a counterattack to De Leon's Arbeiter Zeitung. No stocks and bonds were issued. A board of 9 managers formed the Forward Association of 200 persons. Only members of the Socialist Party can be elected to the governing board when they are approved by a 2/3 majority of its members. No one can invest in the paper, and there are no dividends. But there is an enormous profit. In good times it runs up to $250,000 a year. This money has been used to make the Forward a better paper, to publish a Chicago edition, to help great men in need, and in the distant past to help the labor movement in the United States. In other words, it once gave its readers, mostly trade union men, the money it made from advertising and from their subscriptions. Mr. Cahen did not remain as editor once the paper started. He quit in order to write novels, but in 1902, when the circulation was only 7,000, he was asked to save it from ruin. He called the board together and berated it for filling the paper with polemics, with Marxian dialectics, with nothing but abuse of the capitalists, and with a lot of propaganda. A third of a century later, reminiscing for a reporter of editor and publisher, Abe Cahen told what a sensation his introduction of American-style journalism created in the East Side of New York. He said, quote, "We sent out after human interest stuff and played it up. We started a sports page. What a hullabaloo that raised. We made the paper as lively as possible and made a complete metamorphosis from the dry political tract it originally was. People like our paper and read it. I can remember one story I got about an Italian barber down on Broome Street who fell in love with a Jewish girl. She was very pretty, and he was just crazy about her. But her mother was religious and wouldn't hear of it. Finally, the mother gave in and said they could be married, but the barber would have to become a Jew. And then the old lady made him learn Hebrew and pray every morning with a cap on his head. The poor man couldn't get his breakfast until he prayed. But the girl had a brother named Joe, who was born here in America, and he didn't pray. The barber said, 'Why doesn't Joe have to pray before breakfast?' That made a great stir when we printed it. Some people were shocked at reading such a story in a socialist paper, but people talked about it, and it brought readers. It was fascinating work," unquote. Abe Cahen combined human interest news with crusading. His first big campaign was against the sweatshop in the needle trades. The needle trades union today are still the largest supporters of the forward. One day he published a feature story urging mothers to give their children handkerchiefs. But indignant social leaders demanded of him what the relationship was between the Manifesto of Karl Marx and handkerchiefs for East Side children. Cahen replied, quote, "And since when has socialism been opposed to clean noses?" unquote. Cahen invented letters from the lovelorn. His department in the foreword was called a Bintel brief, meaning a bundle of letters, where men and women told their troubles and got advice. In addition to marriage and divorce, there were thousands of letters discussing the problems of behavior of immigrant Jews in the New World. In recent times, Cahen has been attacked bitterly by the more radical labor movement and by various socialist and communist organizations who do not believe in his socialist program. His journalistic and political policy is as follows, quote, "Things should speak for themselves. The first thing to report is the truth. The foreword is a party paper, but it is first of all a newspaper. I think that party affiliations of newspapers are compatible so long as the newspapers remember their primary purpose. Compared with Yiddish, the English language is like a millionaire compared with a pauper. When I was young, socialistic ideas were considered as dreams. Now you hear them from our most renowned representatives in public life. The New Deal was excellent as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. It will come up again because there will be another depression sooner or later. Capitalism spells depression, and the number of people on relief is bound to grow. It is possible that this country will work its way into socialism without a party, but there will be a third party, and it will be the greatest one. Things are developing in that direction, and a progressive spirit is noticeable in the land. We are working for a change to a better organized economic system. But we are willing to work at a reasonable rate. We aren't damn fools. We don't think the whole building can be pulled down and changed overnight," unquote. But, Despite lip service to socialism, Cahen and his paper have taken the road to reaction. They had always represented the conservative wing, had fought De Leon, Debs, Haywood, Norman Thomas. They first supported, but from 1921 on attacked Soviet Russia, using all the propaganda and Riga falsehoods long before Hearst and McCormick. At the same time, wages of the big editors increased regularly. Cahen now gets $20,000 a year. Worse yet, the foreword has become commercialized. It publishes the usual bad medicine and other advertising, and it has accepted the ads of corporation whose union men were on strike. On more than one occasion, working men have smashed the foreword office windows. In 1922, editor Villard of The Nation called the foreword the best newspaper in America. In 1935, The Nation said that those who had praised Cahen and his sheet were usually unable to read Yiddish and pass judgment. The Nation now compared the foreword to the red-baiting Hearst rags and said Cahen had learned little in 40 years. In 1936, Cahen and his old guard were expelled from the Socialist Party. Liberals have long ago given up the foreword. Radicals regard Cahen as a typical rich bourgeois renegade. In the past year, Mr. Cahen has faced a great problem in the trades situation. The young radical of the 1880s had come up against the CIO industrial union idea, militant labor, the sit-down, and a new radical movement, which he would have been the first to support in his youth. Now, celebrating his 78th birthday in midsummer 1938, he was unable to bring himself to the point of endorsing John L. Lewis, but he joined with the straddlers and red-baiters in hinting at communist quote-unquote control of the new labor organization. In the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, one of the largest components of the CIO, there was considerable anger over a statement Cahen made to the New York Times directed against Sidney Hillman, the union's president. Cahen was reported saying, quote, "I feel that Mr. Hillman's attitude toward the communist movement is objectionable and irresponsible. Mr. Hillman is not a communist, but he does not mind playing with communists when he considers it to his political advantage to do so," unquote. This statement was used by all that part of the press trying to make the CIO appear quote-unquote communist-dominated, and by the red-baiters who had tried to smear Hillman and other progressive labor leaders. The radical of 40 years ago hasn't kept up with the times. Only those who expect miracles nowadays are surprised and shocked. Okay, folks, that concludes Chapter 8. Chapter 7 and 8 we just got through. And this has been Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938, and this has been Rejected Knowledge.